Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Cipher Brief virtual studio. I'm Tom Nagorski. Another day and another set of dizzying headlines about the United States, its place on the global stage. We are in the midst of what looks like a clear and dramatic White House pivot towards Russia, with all the ramifications that has for the war in Ukraine and for relations with Europe and more. Delighted to be joined today by Tom Graham, Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. We usually don't do long resumes on this one, but I'm going to embarrass you a little bit, Tom. A long career spent following Russia in one way or another, posted to Russia, to Moscow twice as a Foreign Service officer, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia at the National Security Council, co-founder of Yale University's Russian Studies program, and his latest book is Getting Russia Right, published in 2023. So, Tom, great to have you with us. And as you know better than most, we can go a long ways. I mean, we can go years without, much change in terms of the U.S.-Russia relationship. And here we are, where it really does seem that, as I said at the top, there's something new to digest and something pretty substantial to digest almost every day. Big picture thing to start. I mean, how do you receive and assess what we've been through on the U.S.-Russia front just over the last 2-3 weeks?
Well, actually, it has been a dizzying series of events over the past few weeks, as you've noted. On the positive side, we are in the process of restoring diplomatic relations. I think that's a good thing. The world is a much more dangerous place when the world's two leading nuclear powers are not engaged in a substantive dialogue about any set of issues. That raises the risk of miscommunications, misperceptions, and direct military confrontation between our two countries. So that's the good news. On the other hand, it's not clear exactly where we're taking this relationship at this point, where the Trump administration, President Trump himself, sees this leading. What type of relationship does he want to develop with Russia over the long term? We're in an era of great power competition. Does he see this relationship as largely competitive? Does he believe that this relationship is going to be a partnership along the lines of what we aspired to 30 years ago at the time of the end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, or does he have something else in mind? Those things are unclear, and it's unfolding the actual character of the relationship day by day since the beginning of the administration.
Everyone we ask about what, and you've sort of just posed questions there, so I'm going to throw a question at you, and maybe it's just one question begets more questions, but we ask about what the administration's strategy may be here vis-a-vis Russia. Your first part of that answer was something that Trump himself, I think, has said is a better U.S.-Russia relationship is better for the rest of the world. Do you think that is the animating principle here, or is it just get a deal on Ukraine any way you can, and you got to talk to the Kremlin to do that? What do you think is, if there is one, a Trump administration Russia strategy at the moment?
I don't believe they have a full-formed Russia strategy at this point. The president came into office on the back of promises to end the Ukraine conflict quickly. He said 24 hours during the campaign. Obviously, it's going to take a little bit longer than that. I do believe that the administration, probably the president himself, has realized that to settle the conflict, that you need a broader dialogue with the Russians. The Russians aren't interested simply in settling the Ukraine conflict. They want to normalize relations, and there is a practical reason for that. There are a lot of issues that only the United States can help resolve for the Russians, Ukraine being one of them, but strategic stability is another. We play a role in the Middle East. But the Russians are also interested in this because relations with the United States is a validation of Russia as a great power. And that's extremely important for the Russian elites. It's extremely important for Putin personally. Putin touts the relationship with China. He's talked about that repeatedly over the past few years. We've never had a better relationship with China before in history. But the fact of the matter is there's only one country that really can validate Russia, as a great power and Putin as a major global leader, and that happens to be the United States.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
You mentioned another positive there, the term strategic stability. If I just list a few of the recent developments, because the other side of the coin is people saying, well, the Trump administration is basically, speaking from Kremlin playbook or Kremlin talking points or what have you. But just this is more for our audience's benefit than yours, Tom. But we have the freezing of aid to Ukraine. We have the White House most recently, I think, having asked the Treasury and State Departments to look at potential sanctions relief with Russia. The Pentagon, the defense secretary, saying, let's suspend offensive cyber and information operations against Russia. And then that whole scene, in the Oval Office last week, the berating of Zelensky, earlier calling him a dictator. How do you assess all of that? Because I think we heard Secretary of State Rubio the other day saying, well, we need to talk to the Russians, and so we're not going to bash them. But this, I'm going to put words in your mouth. This really seems to be going way on the other side of the pendulum, right?
Yeah, it does. But, there are two challenges here, and I think the Trump administration is focused on only one of them. The challenge is how do you bring Ukraine to the negotiating table? The Ukrainians have made it clear over the past several months that they're not interested in a simple ceasefire. They want security guarantees. They want to know how they're going to defend themselves against Russia in the future. How are they going to preserve their independence and sovereignty? And President Trump really just wants to get that ceasefire. He knows that Ukraine is in a weak position, and so he's exercising the leverage he has to try to bludgeon them into agreeing to whatever his vision of a ceasefire is. The other problem, and I don't think the Trump administration has given due attention to that, is how do you bring Russia to the negotiating table? The Russians have made it clear over the past several months that they are not interested in negotiations that lead to a simple ceasefire. They keep talking about what they call the root causes of the conflict, which really are two things. That is their concern about what they see as anti-Russian policies inside Ukraine, and more importantly, the role of NATO in Europe's security architecture. And they want those issues addressed before they're prepared to agree to a ceasefire. I think that to some extent what the administration is doing is to suggest that it may be prepared to deal with those, but these are really complicated issues, and there are no easy solutions to them. Rhetoric about Ukraine not joining NATO, suspension of offensive cyber operations means very little in the real world. Take the cyber operations in particular. It's very difficult to know whether something that the United States is doing is a defensive operation or an offensive operation. They look pretty much the same until you pull the trigger and do something. So I think the Kremlin takes a lot of this with a grain of salt at this point. They're looking for hard decisions, actions by the United States. And not rhetoric at this point. I'll make one final point, and which may be sort of counterintuitive. They don't want the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship to blow up because they need the United States to bring the Ukrainians to the table. They don't want the Europeans to interfere. And when the relationship between the United States and Ukraine is on the rocks, we see exactly what we've seen over the past 24 to 48 hours, the Europeans stepping up and trying to do something. That only complicates the issue as far as Moscow is concerned. Moscow wants to deal directly with the United States on these broad issues, Ukraine in particular, and they want the United States to bring the Ukrainians along. They want to keep the Europeans out of this to the extent possible. So While they're not entirely disappointed with the way things are going, there's still some questions about the U.S. ability to manage this in ways that will lead to a resolution of the conflict that addresses Russian interests.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. You wrote, it probably seems to you, Tom, like an eon ago, but in January, late January, you wrote a big piece for the Council on Foreign Relations about, kind of the parameters and quite detailed suggestions about how a deal might take shape. And high up in that piece, you said that for any negotiations to work, Vladimir Putin would have to be convinced that time is not on his side. And am I right that it sure seems now, at least compared to them, that time, maybe it's not on his side, but it really isn't on President Zelensky's side, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As someone once said, both sides are losing the conflict, but Ukraine is losing it faster than the Russians are.
Mm-hmm.
Look, the Kremlin still does believe that time is on its side. It's making grinding progress on the battlefield. Its economy has proven to be resilient against Western sanctions. Economy has grown by over 3.5% in the past 2 years. You see Ukraine's problems in mobilizing forces meant for the front lines. You see flagging Western support for Ukraine. If I'm in the Kremlin, I can keep talking about I'm willing to negotiate this, that, and the other thing, but I'm under no pressing need to have those negotiations. I can wait for things to move in my direction. So I think that's where the Kremlin is at this point. The challenge, as I wrote in that piece for the United States, is to demonstrate that time is not on Putin's side. And I listed a number of actions that I thought would move in that direction, not anything that the administration has done at this point.
I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but haven't all the things we ran through, especially the suspension of aid, and I mean, if you're looking at whatever the metric of time on your side, hasn't that now tilted dramatically in favor of the Kremlin, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. I mean, that's the point I'm making.
Right.
They look at the situation as it's developing, and the question you're asking in the Kremlin is, why should I back away from any of my maximal demands?
Right.
Even if I don't get to negotiations at some point, I am making progress on the battlefield, and I'll continue to make progress on the battlefield. So if I'm in the Kremlin, I'm sitting pretty at this point. Let's see what the United States is prepared to do, how they're going to lean on Ukraine, what types of concessions they're going to get out of the Ukrainians that again serve my interest. The argument, that I'm making is that does not serve the United States' interest over the long run. We really do need to preserve an independent and sovereign Ukraine. That should be sort of the minimal goal that the United States is pursuing, and that requires a set of actions that bring Moscow to the negotiating table, because it has come to the conclusion that time is no longer on my side. I need to cut a deal, and to cut that deal, I need to back off my maximal demands. That's not where we're headed at this point.
Last question, Tom, and I know you can't share all the details, but you were just in Russia, which is not something many Western scholars and experts on that country can say. Anything you can share with us about the takeaways? And I gather this is just a few weeks ago, right?
It was a couple of weeks ago. The takeaways are quite straightforward. That the Kremlin is quite pleased that the Trump administration has decided to reopen diplomatic relations with Russia, sort of breaking the isolation that the Biden administration had put it in, at least as far as contacts with the West are concerned. But that is coupled with some skepticism about Trump's ability to move forward in the relationship. There are still deep cleavages between the United States and Russia on a whole range of issues, not only Ukraine, but the Middle East, the Arctic, strategic stability. There is concern that that President Trump has in his head an idea of what this settlement looks like, which is not the idea that the Russians have in their head about how this settlement looks like.
Right.
Take the recent comment by President Trump that Putin would be okay with Western peacekeeping forces, right? Then Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, has to get up the next day and say, "Whoa, we're not. That's not where we are." So there's real concern that the president is not hearing what the Russians are saying, that he doesn't understand what the Russian position is, and that can lead to a complication down the road, because if Trump thinks he has a deal because he's imagined what the Russians have agreed to or prepared to agree to, and they say no, then Trump's position flips. So he's focused on the Ukrainians now, who appear to be the major obstacle to this quick ceasefire he has. But it could turn out, if he's not listening to the Russians, that the Russians become the problem. Again, they're cautiously optimistic that things are moving in the right direction. But the president is mercurial, he's unpredictable, and that has the Kremlin on edge.
Got it. And that has us all thinking, what are we going to do tomorrow? So, Tom Graham, thank you so much for being with us at the Cipher Brief. Tom Graham, Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Yale University, a lot of other places. It's great to have you with us. Appreciate your insights.
Glad to be with you.